Welcome back to Arkansas, where we try to make sense of the issues affecting Arkansans, and today we're going to talk about our 2022 ballot, specifically Issue 4, the Arkansas Adult Use Cannabis Amendment. Issue 4 reached the ballot by way of a citizens' initiative, meaning enough registered voters in the state signed a copy of the proposed amendment, agreeing they wanted the whole state to be able to vote on it. And Issue 4 is an amendment to the state constitution, so if it passes, it would exist as the highest legal standard in the state, above all other state laws and statutes. Issue 4 is full of details and is likely the most controversial ballot issue this election cycle. As such, we're going to get pretty in the weeds, so there are links in the description to skip to each section in case you need to watch a bit now and come back to it later. But if you're ready to go, we need to start with some definitions and some history. So let's dive in. Marijuana is a generic name for psychoactive drugs made from the plant of the cannabis genus. The drug has multiple compounds that act on the body when ingested, most notably THC and CBD. As with every drug, marijuana's effects can vary largely based on your own body's chemistry, but the most common positive reactions are feelings of euphoria and relaxation, and heightened sensations like sight and taste. Neutral or negative side effects can include hunger, dulled awareness of your own body, slowed reaction time, and increased anxiety or irritability. And some studies also indicate it can exacerbate existing psychological conditions like schizophrenia. The legal history of marijuana in America is complicated and well documented elsewhere, so we're just going to cover the most recent bits. In 1971, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, which established modern U.S. policy regarding drug laws. Under that act, drugs were divided into classifications called schedules. Marijuana was labeled Scheduled 1, the most dangerous level, meaning according to that act, it had a high potential for abuse and little or no medical value, and was even more dangerous than cocaine or methamphetamines. This officially outlawed marijuana on a federal level, and was still in effect prior to the 2022 election. Just 1 year after marijuana was classified as a Schedule 1 drug, a panel was appointed by President Nixon to study marijuana and its effects. The commission came back with the recommendation that marijuana be scheduled to a lower tier and treated more like alcohol, but the Nixon administration refused. The conflicting messages coming from the federal government opened the door for states to push back. And while the federal government can send federal law enforcement to enforce federal marijuana laws, it's up to state and local officials whether they enforce state and local laws, or whether they even have those laws at all. Just a few years after the Controlled Substances Act passed, some states began decriminalizing marijuana, meaning possession and use were treated more like a parking violation than a high-level criminal offense. Some states also initiated medical marijuana programs, allowing patients with a prescription to own, use, or grow small amounts. And then in 2012, Colorado and Washington became the first states to legalize marijuana entirely. In states where recreational marijuana has become legal, it's still heavily regulated. Like cigarettes in Arkansas, sales and use are limited to people 21 and older, and most of the things you can't legally do while drunk, you also cannot do while high. And like many strong prescription medicines, there's a maximum amount of marijuana you can have in your possession at any one time. Prior to the 2022 election, 19 states have legalized recreational marijuana, and Arkansas is one of 5 more voting to legalize it this November. Arkansas voted to legalize medical marijuana back in 2016 when they passed Amendment 98. That amendment allows adult Arkansans with a prescription from a state-certified doctor to buy and use limited quantities of marijuana. The process of implementing Amendment 98 was rocky, to say the least, and it wasn't until 2019 that sales of medical marijuana actually began. Since then, the state has licensed 8 cultivation facilities, where the marijuana is grown and turned into usable products, in 40 stores called dispensaries. There are over 78,000 Arkansans who are prescribed medical marijuana, and it's a moneymaker for the state. From June of 2021 to June of 2022, state taxes on medical marijuana brought in over $22 million in revenue. But isn't this all still illegal? All of the states that allow for medical or recreational marijuana are technically in violation of federal law. Now, back in 2014, Congress passed the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment, which prohibited the federal government from spending any money to interfere with implementation of state medical marijuana laws. But no such restriction exists for enforcement on recreational use. However, Practically speaking, federal agencies do not have enough people or resources to strictly enforce federal marijuana laws. Since the Obama administration, the Justice Department has essentially decided to only prioritize enforcing marijuana laws in specific circumstances where they feel marijuana is most harmful, like gang violence and sales to minors. If you use marijuana in a state where it's legal and abide by the state rules, you're unlikely to face any federal consequences just for using marijuana, as long as you're not doing it on federal land, like a national park, or while using a federally funded service, like public housing or a state college. But as of November 2022, possession or use which is legal in your state could still disqualify you from certain federal aid programs and have other consequences as well. However, that all may be about to change. Just about 2 weeks before early voting started for the 2022 election, President Biden announced a change in federal marijuana policy. First, he pardoned all federal charges for simple possession, which means possessing a small amount of marijuana for personal use with no intent to distribute it. President Biden also encouraged state governors to do the same, a request which Governor Asa Hutchinson immediately rejected. Finally, President Biden officially initiated the process to review marijuana's federal classification as a Schedule I drug. If marijuana ends up at a lower classification, it would open the doors to more research, fewer conflicts between federal and state policies, and possible federal decriminalization. So, now that you know the background, let's go over what this new amendment actually says. Because this amendment is incredibly detailed, we're going to go over the text section by section. Sections 1, 2, and 3 set the title of the amendment, when it would take effect, and lay out some definitions. Perhaps most important is the creation of 2 tiers of cultivation facilities. Tier 1 cultivation facilities can, quote, cultivate, prepare, manufacture, process, or package, unquote, an unlimited amount of marijuana plants and products, and sell those to any Tier 1 or 2 facilities and dispensaries. Meanwhile, Tier 2 facilities are a bit more restricted. Their list of allowed actions does not include processing. They can only sell to dispensaries, and they can only have a maximum of 250 mature plants at any one time. Next is Section 4, the actual legalization bit. Under Section 4, adults in Arkansas, that's anyone 21 and up, would be allowed to possess up to 1 ounce of cannabis, as long as it's only for use by adults. Section 5 lists 17 changes that Issue 4 would make to the original Arkansas Medical Marijuana Amendment. Some of them are the kinds of simple rewrites you might expect, like eliminating rules that marijuana can only be grown or sold for medical purposes. But there are some bigger changes too. People who have medical marijuana cards would still be able to get their prescription amount up to a maximum of 2.5 ounces every 2 weeks, on top of the 1 ounce of recreational they could buy, meaning they could possess up to 3.5 ounces total. Also, medical marijuana would no longer be taxed. The amendment gives the Alcoholic Beverage Commission the right to set their own medical marijuana labeling standards. Meanwhile, the State Medical Marijuana Commission would be in charge of making sure all marijuana is sold in child-resistant packaging and that the design of the packaging is not appealing to children. But the amendment ends the Commission's previous authority to set restrictions on the artwork and building signs that cultivation facilities and dispensaries use. The amendment would also loosen some of the old restrictions on business owners. Anyone who owned less than a 5% share of a cultivation facility or dispensary would be exempt from the criminal background checks previously required from all owners. Cultivation facility owners would no longer be required to be a resident of Arkansas, and there would no longer be a maximum limit on the potency of marijuana-containing food or drinks. Dispensaries would no longer be barred from selling bongs, rolling papers, or other smoking accessories, and dispensaries could grow up to 100 plants, double the number previously allowed. And there's one final big change to the medical marijuana rules. The original medical marijuana amendment allowed the state legislature to change certain sections of those laws with a simple majority vote. But Issue 4 would alter that, so no changes could be made to the medical marijuana program in the future unless that change went to a vote of the people. Next, Section 6 gets into the nitty-gritty of how the Alcoholic Beverage Commission will create and issue the new licenses for recreational marijuana businesses. So here's how the licensing would go. 8 recreational cultivation licenses would go to the 8 locations that already have a medical cultivation license. The 40 operating medical dispensaries would also get licenses to dispense recreational. But then those same 40 dispensaries would also get a second recreational license. In order to use it, they would have to set up a new store location at least 5 miles away from any existing medical dispensary. And those secondary locations can only sell recreational, so they cannot cannot fill a medical marijuana prescription. After that initial set of licenses had gone to existing medical growers and sellers, the ABC would open up applications for new owners. There would be 12 Tier 2 cultivation licenses, with the limitations we talked about earlier, as well as 40 recreational dispensary licenses. And those would be the last licenses. Issue 4 places the upper limit for total recreational licenses at 8 Tier 1, 12 Tier 2, and 120 dispensaries. Section 6 then says that any one person or business cannot have an ownership interest in more than 18 recreational dispensary licenses. Finally, Section 6 ends by giving the Arkansas ABC the right to set additional rules for licensing, including how licenses could be transferred or reissued, standards for security at the facilities, what kind of record keeping has to happen, etc. Section 7 says that state subdivisions, like cities or counties, are allowed to vote to prohibit recreational sales, just like some counties do now with alcohol. But in the places where it is legal, they cannot do tricky things like change their zoning ordinances in order to try and keep dispensaries from opening. Section 8 sets a 10% sales tax on recreational marijuana, and that's in addition to existing state and local taxes. And here's how that money would be distributed. 15% would go to a yearly payment to all full-time certified Arkansas law enforcement officers who are in good standing. 10% would fund the operation of the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. 5% goes to fund Arkansas drug court programs. After that, a portion balances the budget of the organizations regulating the recreational marijuana program, and finally, whatever money is left goes to the state general fund. Section 9 specifies the things this amendment would not do. For example, it would not keep employers from firing people for marijuana use. It would not keep property owners or businesses from banning marijuana, and it would not give individuals the right to grow or distribute their own. Section 10 says that if any one portion of the amendment is thrown out by the courts, it does not disqualify the entire amendment. It also says that any existing laws which conflict with this new amendment are assumed to be overridden. Section 11 is some technical housekeeping, and finally, Section 12 says this entire amendment cannot be changed by the General Assembly without sending it to Arkansans to vote on again. Before we move on, let's dive into a few details that are in the bill, and a few that aren't. Issue 4 defines cannabis as marijuana and other substances including any parts of the plant Cannabis sativa. That definition raises another question. Arkansas currently has a thriving hemp industry, which produces rope, paper, and biofuels, as well as CBD and hemp oil. Issue 4 does not explicitly make any changes to the hemp laws, but the Arkansas Industrial Hemp Production Act defines industrial hemp as the plant Cannabis sativa and any parts of the plant, if the plant contains under a certain amount of THC. That creates two overlapping definitions. All things defined as hemp would also be defined as cannabis. And since Issue 4 is a constitutional amendment, it would be the higher law, so its definition wins. It may be that hemp producers continue on using those low THC plants and just can't sell plants or products to dispensaries or cultivators. But again, the specifics are not laid out within Issue 4, so expect that to land in state court at some point. Issue 4 also does not include the sealing or expunging of past marijuana crimes in the state, so anyone with prior convictions would still have them and still have to serve their sentences or pay their penalties. The decision to not include these was intentional, largely because Arkansas ballot issues are required to be only about a single issue. According to the folks who wrote Issue 4, they worried that if they included sealing and expunging, the single issue rule would have been used to throw Issue 4 off the ballot. The same group says they are, quote, working with legislators to draft a comprehensive expungement bill for those convicted of simple possession of cannabis, unquote. But passing Issue 4 does not guarantee that will happen. And one last clarification. Under Issue 4, it is still illegal to operate a motorized vehicle while under the influence of cannabis. It's also legal for places of business to fire you for failing a marijuana test. But there's a catch to that. Right now, there is not a reliable test for how high a person is at one given time. To understand why, let's compare it to alcohol. Alcohol has one active compound, ethanol. Your body breaks down ethanol really quickly and expels a portion of it through your lungs. So if you're currently exhaling broken down ethanol, you have ethanol in your body right now. So a high number on a breathalyzer test is a reasonable indication you've been drinking alcohol very recently. But marijuana does not work that way. It has multiple active compounds which break down at different rates and affect your body at different speeds and intensities. And the most common tests for marijuana are testing urine, saliva, or hair, all of which would still contain THC days days after you're done being high. So it's worth being aware that a positive marijuana test could lose you your license, your job, or lead to other penalties, even if you weren't high while you were doing those things. So now that you know what issue 4 says, let's lay out some basic information and debunk some existing myths. Literally every piece of data that you hear about marijuana, you should be skeptical of. Marijuana's federal status as a Schedule I drug has largely prevented funding for the type of wide-scale research needed to get large data samples. That classification also means that data on real-world use is from people who use actual marijuana, which means there's no precision in dosing and plenty of people afraid to be honest about their experiences. Meanwhile, until very recently, most laboratory studies were done using isolated compounds derived from marijuana, which makes one-to-one comparisons difficult. But we do have enough data to say at least a few things with some confidence. Marijuana absolutely can be addictive. The addiction can stem from a combination of things, including brain changes as a result of repeated use, as well as psychological and social factors. CDC estimates place the likelihood of addiction at between 10 and 30% for all users, which, while substantial, also makes it less addictive than cocaine, opioids, or cigarettes. For both addicts and casual users, marijuana use generally correlates to fewer negative health outcomes than similar use levels of cigarettes or alcohol, and marijuana can be an effective substitute for opioids for chronic pain management. We also have a fair amount of data from the 19 states that have legalized recreational use already. Generally speaking, states where marijuana has been legalized have neither experienced all the positive effects promised by proponents, nor the negative ones predicted by naysayers. Crime rates have not significantly increased or decreased. Legal marijuana has not been the gateway drug that some folks feared, with levels of use for other drugs remaining about the same, but that also means it did not help folks transition away from harder drugs. And while some people want to end possession charges because of the racial disparities in charging and sentencing, those same disparities now just exist for folks who violate new recreational marijuana laws. Illegal marijuana growth and sales have decreased in states where dispensaries are plentiful and legal supply is high. Arkansas has around 3 million people, and issue 4 would allow for 120 dispensaries, or about 4 dispensaries for every 100,000 Arkansans. That's a higher per capita rate of dispensaries than California or Nevada, but lower than Washington and much lower than Colorado, Oregon, or Alaska. It's important to make sure there are enough dispensaries, because if there aren't, prices can rise and supply can fail to meet demand. In California, their low rate is in part because many cities decided to ban sales. In those cities, illegal sales have increased since supply in nearby areas is high. Arkansas could face the same issue if some cities or counties choose to ban marijuana. Those areas would both have to deal with a potential spike in illegal sales and also would miss out on the local tax revenue from legal sales. The largest measurable effects on states with recreational marijuana seem to exist in two areas. First, the number of marijuana users has increased across all age ranges. That includes teenagers, and there is some data to suggest that regular use of marijuana during teenage years leads to decrease in cognitive functioning. The second consistent effect of legalization is positive economic results, more tax income, and more jobs. Every state that has legalized marijuana reports a significant net financial benefit. It's hard to do direct income comparisons, though, since some states tax marijuana at a flat rate, while others have specific taxes on products or potency, and some add state taxes afterwards and some don't. But among states that charge a flat tax rate, most charge between 10 and 21%. Arkansas at 10% would be tied for the second lowest flat tax rate in America. Before we move on to arguments around issue 4, let's address some of the things that you might have seen or heard from the official campaigns for and against issue 4. The ads running in favor of issue 4 come from Responsible Growth Arkansas, who've raised around $5 million in support of the amendment. Their ads focus on claims issue 4 will bring in new tax funds, police funding, and funding for UAMS research. All true, if vague, based on issue 4's tax distribution. Some of their commercials use more exact but speculative numbers, which should be assumed to be optimistic. One of their ads also claims issue 4 will create thousands of new jobs. While that number is also speculative, mathematically it makes sense. With 120 dispensaries and 20 cultivation facilities opening or expanding, each would only need to hire 9 people to create over 2,000 jobs. By keeping their claims vague, the campaign in favor of Issue 4 can generally avoid any factual missteps. Perhaps the only truly misleading thing from their campaign is on the FAQs portion of their website. While most of the points are not blatantly incorrect, in response to criticism about the lack of a background check for people with a less than 5% stake in a recreational business, the site says, quote, "All owners must be identified and provide background information to the ABC, which has the authority to investigate any aspect of concern," unquote. But the background information those owners have to provide is not equivalent to a criminal background check from the Arkansas State Police, which is currently required for all part owners of any medical marijuana business. Meanwhile, a group called Safe and Secure Communities is the best funded opposition to Issue 4, having raised over $2 million. Their website has been shared widely by Arkansas politicians and candidates at all levels of state government. And here is the commercial from that website.
Proponents of Issue 4 claim legalizing marijuana will protect our communities, but the facts tell a different story. In states that have legalized marijuana, marijuana-related traffic deaths have doubled, youth drug use has skyrocketed, and a major hospital reported that nearly 50% of newborns are testing positive for marijuana. Issue 4 places our children and our communities at risk. Arkansas is better off without legalized marijuana. Vote no on Issue 4.
The claim that marijuana-related traffic deaths have doubled is sourced to a study from the Rocky Mountain High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Area, which is primarily focused on Colorado. According to that study, since Colorado legalized recreational marijuana, the average number of fatal crashes in a year has increased, but so has the state population. If you control for crashes per population or for total miles driven each year, that number remains relatively flat, so marijuana legalization did not contribute to a net increase in traffic deaths per capita. There was also not a significant increase in accidents exclusively related to marijuana, but more of the people who were already impaired by alcohol or other drugs now also test positive for THC, which makes sense. When any given person in your state is more likely to be using marijuana, nearly any activity that happens at a steady rate will have an increase in the number of marijuana-related incidents of that thing. The second claim in the commercial, that youth drug use has skyrocketed, is cited to the same source. The implication sounds like marijuana legalization has increased the use of other drugs, but in fact, marijuana legalization has only been linked to an increased use in marijuana. Quoting the exact study cited in the commercial, quote, "At this point, there has been a lack of research supporting the causal relationship between marijuana use and other drugs," unquote. The final claim in the commercial is that in one state where marijuana has been legalized, a major hospital reported nearly 50% of newborns were testing positive for marijuana. In fact, the hospital, St. Mary Corwin Medical Center in Pueblo, Colorado, only tested babies it was already worried had been exposed to drugs during pregnancy. And the time frame for the testing only covers 1 month, March of 2016. In that month, 52 babies were born at the hospital. 11 were tested because of suspected drug exposure, of which 5 tested positive for THC. That is an incredibly small sample size, and again, a sample size made only of children already suspected of drug exposure from 1 month from one hospital. Again, this ad is notable because it's one of the primary pieces of media put out by the best funded campaign against Issue 4, and the website hosting it, shared by state officials, contains similar misrepresentations of data. These are, to put it charitably, misleading arguments, so we will not include them in our arguments against the bill. Instead, we're going to present what we believe are the strongest arguments from both sides. With those facts out of the way, let's look at the strongest arguments for and against Issue 4. Folks in favor of Issue 4 argue it would help prevent some Arkansans from having their lives ruined over a marijuana charge. In 2021, 9,032 Arkansans were charged with marijuana possession only, not manufacturing or intent to distribute, just having marijuana. A charge of possession in Arkansas for under 4 ounces is punishable by up to a year in jail and a fine of up to $2,500. A second charge for under 4 ounces, or your first charge for more than 4 ounces, is a felony, which will remain on your criminal record until it's expunged or sealed. That felony will prevent you from voting, bar you from certain state-run programs, and could hurt your chances of future employment. Arkansas also has a smoke a joint, lose lose your license policy. So any conviction for possession of any amount comes with a mandatory 6-month suspension of your driver's license. For anyone who needs to drive to work or go to school, that can be detrimental. And even if someone is found innocent or strikes a plea deal, there are potential costs for bail, lawyers' fees, or mandatory drug courses. While Issue 4 would not expunge or seal existing possession charges, it would prevent some of those 9,000 plus charges each year in the future. Having a legal market for marijuana could also take customers away from illegal sales and manufacturing, and having fewer marijuana charges to pursue could free up the police to focus their time on other, more pressing issues. Plus, the taxes from Issue 4 go to funding law enforcement stipends and drug courts. Proponents of Issue 4 argue that when it comes to marijuana, the punishment does not fit the crime. So from both a legal and empathetic position, ending possession charges for amounts under 1 ounce is the best thing to do for our state. Another argument for Issue 4 is that it would have a significant positive impact on the state economy. Recreational marijuana will have its own 10% sales tax, plus the 6.5% state sales tax. The Arkansas Economic Development Institute estimates that the combination of those two taxes, even when you subtract no longer taxing medical marijuana, would bring in $286.5 million in new state revenue over the next 5 years. On top of that, they estimate $30 million more in state revenue from income taxes on the business owners and another $50 million in county and municipal taxes. Those numbers are projected, of course, and subject to demand, but Issue 4 would definitely bring in new tax revenue. And those taxes pay for generally popular things like the police and UAMS cancer research, and the portion that goes to the general fund could create a surplus, allowing for tax cuts in other areas. And that money would not just come from Arkansans. If Issue 4 passes, there is likely to be an influx of weed tourism, people who come from surrounding states to enjoy our legal marijuana. Marijuana is still not legal for recreational use in any of the 6 states that touch Arkansas, and it's completely illegal in Tennessee and Texas. If Issue 3 passes, Arkansas would be the only state in the South with recreational marijuana, potentially generating a huge new source of tourism. And more tourists means more tourism dollars spent and more tax revenue for the state. While we're talking about finances, one of the criticisms aimed at Issue 4 is that it would allow people outside of Arkansas to own our marijuana industry because it eliminates the residency requirements for owners of cultivation facilities. But some Issue 4 supporters argue that outside investment in Arkansas would be a good thing. Both processing facilities and dispensaries would employ Arkansans and generate revenue for the state. So that's money from outside of Arkansas, which creates new jobs and which pays city, county, and state taxes before those profits can leave the state. Proponents of Issue 4 argue that any potential negative fiscal consequences of the amendment are far outweighed by the good that will come from the creation of those new jobs and the new tax revenue. Also, while we're talking about out-of-state money, it's true that most of the funding for the campaign for Issue 4 comes from existing medical growers and sellers. But under the current medical laws, those are all businesses owned by Arkansans. But the $2 billion in funding against Issue 4 have come almost entirely from just 2 people. One is a Utah billionaire and heir to the Schlitz beer fortune. The other is an Arkansas poultry magnate who has donated millions of dollars to fund the campaigns of Tom Cotton, Mike Huckabee, and other politicians. Some folks for Issue 4 argue it's better to vote for something that benefits existing Arkansas businesses than to let 2 wealthy donors, one of them not an Arkansan, sway the direction of our state. Issue 4 has also received criticism claiming its system for handing out new licenses creates an unfair advantage for the already existing marijuana businesses. But some Issue 4 supporters say that might be the best way to ensure recreational marijuana actually gets rolling in a timely manner. One of the reasons the Arkansas medical marijuana program took years to get up and running was because of issues with the licensing process. Giving the first licenses to existing marijuana businesses who are already familiar with the licensing process and personnel could speed things up and help ensure recreational marijuana is available as soon as possible. And while the Tier 1 licenses would initially go to those existing businesses, the ABC would set its own policy on how to distribute them when one of those businesses closes down. Some proponents of Issue 4 argue that the advantages created by the licensing rules are temporary and worth the trade-off of getting recreational marijuana up and running as quickly as possible. Another argument for Issue 4 is that many of the small changes it makes will significantly improve the medical marijuana program. That starts by eliminating the sales taxes for patients, but perhaps just as importantly, it also eliminates the state legislature's ability to continually change portions of the program in the future, which some folks argue they've used to make the medical program purposely difficult to implement. If Issue 4 passes, citizens still have the option to try and change the medical or recreational programs later with a ballot initiative, but the legislature would not be able to amend either program without going through the citizens. Folks who think our legislature is actively hostile towards marijuana argue we need those safeguards in place now so the legislature doesn't have more opportunities to make the existing program worse. And speaking of the legislature's efforts against marijuana, a final argument for Issue 4 is that if recreational marijuana doesn't pass in the state now, it's probably not going to get any easier to pass in the future. If you saw our Issue 2 video, you know that the Arkansas legislature has spent the past 6 years making it more difficult to get citizen initiatives on the ballot. They've put stricter rules on who can gather signatures, changed who reviews ballot titles, and eliminated the grace period that used to exist for correcting issues or errors. In fact, those exact changes almost kept Issue 4 off the ballot. And if Issue 2 passes this year, future ballot issues would need 60% of the vote to pass, rather than a simple majority. Even some of the folks who don't agree with all of the provisions of Issue 4 might still argue that it's better to legalize recreational marijuana now than risk waiting for a future amendment that could have far more trouble getting passed. Overall, many folks in favor of Issue 4 say it's an improvement to our current laws in a lot of ways. And if Arkansas wants to become the first state in the South with legalized marijuana, largely against the wishes of our legislature, it may have to happen in a way that's too cautious and corporate focused for some folks. But those in favor might say if it doesn't happen that way, it may never happen at all. So, if you believe that Arkansans should not face penalties for marijuana possession for personal use, or you believe that the potential positive economic impact of legalization outweighs potential downsides, or if you believe that recreational needs to pass as soon as possible to keep the Arkansas legislature from blocking it in the future, then you'll want to vote for Issue 4. There are two general types of arguments against Issue 4. Arguments that recreational marijuana should not be legal in Arkansas, and arguments that it should, but Issue 4 is not the way to do it. The former arguments are very similar to the arguments previously used against medical marijuana, but with more strength now that marijuana would potentially be available to all adults. For example, the financial benefits are speculative and have to be weighed against additional costs for law enforcement. The usage rate of marijuana among teenagers is likely to increase. And today's marijuana is much stronger than it used to be, which increases the risk of addiction. Plus, if you already aren't a fan of the state's medical marijuana program, you probably don't want to expand it to recreational. But the primary argument from folks who do want legalization but are against Issue 4 is the accusation that its details create unfair business advantages for existing medical marijuana businesses, and in doing so, cripple the potential of any newcomers to the industry without serving the patients and customers the way that it should. Here's why they say that. Under the rules of Issue 4, the existing medical cultivation sites would be given all of the Tier 1 recreational cultivation licenses. Those Tier 1 licenses allow for an unlimited number of mature plants and sales to any kind of growth facility or dispensary. But if someone in Arkansas wanted to start a new cultivation business, there would be no opportunity for them to have a Tier 1 facility until one of those existing businesses closes down or loses their license, which could be years or even decades. Meanwhile, any new cultivator would have to vie for one of the 12 Tier 2 licenses. Those only allow for sales to dispensaries and limit owners to 250 mature plants. That's only 2.5 times more than what every dispensary is able to own, and far fewer than the thousands of plants owned by even the smallest single current cultivator. Proponents of Issue 4 justify this by saying the Tier 2 license will create craft marijuana businesses, much like craft beer brewers. But there is no law keeping a craft beer brewery from expanding if they do well. Opponents also claim the scheduling for the licensing rollout creates an advantage for existing growers. Tier 1 cultivation licenses go out by March of 2023 to the facilities already making products, so they'll be ready to start business fairly quickly. But then there is an 8-month gap before the Tier 2 licenses go out, and all of the new dispensaries are licensed in between that time. That means Tier 1 facilities will have up to 8 months to establish business with dispensaries before Tier 2 businesses can buy a single plant. By capping the growth of new cultivators and getting a head start on relationships with dispensaries, Issue 4 means that for the foreseeable future, the existing medical growers could maintain a monopoly on the industry. Issue 2 opponents say an unfair advantage also exists for the dispensary licenses. First, there won't be any new medical dispensary licenses issued, which again locks out new folks looking to get into the industry. It also means medical marijuana patients who live far away from medical dispensaries aren't likely to see that change. Second, medical dispensaries automatically get both a recreational upgrade for their existing business and a second license to open a new recreational facility, making them the sole providers of medical marijuana and owners of 2/3 of the recreational dispensaries. They'll also get those new permits up to 4 months before new dispensary businesses do. That means the existing businesses will have early choice at where to put their new location. Each new recreational dispensary has to be located at least 5 miles from any existing medical dispensary. And it only takes a quick bit of math to know that a circle with a 5-mile radius has an area of 78.54 square miles. And that is larger than the area of literally every city in Arkansas except Little Rock and Jonesboro. Most large Arkansas cities already have multiple medical dispensaries, meaning that new dispensaries will be relegated to less desirable locations, and the existing businesses will get the first pick. So, having set up the existing owners of cultivation facilities to monopolize mass cultivation, and setting up the existing dispensary owners to monopolize medical dispensaries, and own 2/3 of all new dispensary licenses, the bill also removes residency requirements for cultivation facility owners, meaning that the Tier 2 cultivation licenses could be owned by out-of-state interests. And then it allows anyone to own a stake in up to 18 dispensaries. There are only 40 new dispensary licenses going out, so someone with enough money could feasibly have an ownership stake in nearly half of all new dispensary licenses. And after all of that, Issue 4 sets the tax rate on recreational marijuana at 10%, the second lowest flat rate in America. They could have easily set a tax rate closer to the national average, which would have meant far more money for the UAMS and police programs they're happy to use in their commercials. But by setting a low tax rate, those businesses take home more of the sales price as profits. And for some folks against Issue 4, the proof of this corruption is in the financing for the campaign. The funds donated to the pro-Issue 4 group Responsible Growth Arkansas totaled $13 million, and existing Arkansas medical marijuana companies are the biggest donors. In fairness, it's likely these companies would donate to any recreational amendment since their facilities would be immediately ready to start selling. But it's also entirely possible that they are willing to donate far more to this particular campaign, knowing the potential financial windfall coming their way from Issue 4. So to some folks, Issue 4 looks like a bunch of businesses who want a monopoly trying to buy their way into the state constitution. Outside of the corruption accusations, some folks are against Issue 4 because of some of the things it does not do. Issue 4 does not expunge or seal the records of people with former marijuana convictions, meaning there would still be folks in prison or with felony charges for something that would no longer be illegal. Issue 4 also does not provide employees any protections, so anyone in Arkansas who tests positive for the newly legal drug could still be fired, even if it had no negative effect on their job performance. Issue 4 also does not allow medical marijuana patients to buy their tax-free larger quantities of marijuana from the newly opened recreational facilities. And Issue 4 still leaves many of the decisions about the state medical marijuana program in the hands of the Arkansas Medical Marijuana Commission, which is a 5-member committee with 1 member appointed by the governor and the other 4 appointed by the highest-ranking members of the Arkansas House and Senate. That means for the foreseeable future, parts of the Arkansas medical marijuana program will still be indirectly controlled by a legislature that has been largely hostile to marijuana in any form. Issue 4 also does not allow Arkansans to grow marijuana at home, which means the limited number of cultivators would be the only suppliers in the state. Meanwhile, marijuana tourism from other states means the supply is not just divided among Arkansans, but among folks from the surrounding states as well. The limits that Issue 4 sets on cultivators and dispensaries could leave the state without enough marijuana for the combination of Arkansans and tourists, which could drive up prices for everyone. And since the only medical growers will now also be recreational growers, shortages could lead to medical patients not having a sufficient supply. And Issue 4 does not include a mechanism to make sure medical medical patients' needs are filled before recreational, and a shortage could lead people to return to buying and selling illegally to make up for the shortfall. Some opponents of Issue 4 say the lack of home grow is yet another of the many ways Issue 4 prioritizes businesses over people. Finally, remember how some Issue 4 advocates say it needs to pass right now because the legislature keeps trying to make ballot initiatives harder? That argument can cut both ways. Whatever rules change between now and the next election, it would take the same ballot initiative process with the same difficulties for citizens to either amend Issue 4 or start from scratch. Between the business benefits, the loopholes, and the things it's missing, some folks say that if Issue 4 passes, we're going to have to amend it anyway. And if we're going to have to pass another amendment anyway, for some folks, it's worth waiting and not locking Issue 4's potential negative consequences into the Arkansas Constitution in the meantime. So if you think that the potential dangers of recreational marijuana are not worth the risks, or if you think the advantages Issue 4 gives to existing marijuana businesses outweigh its potential benefits, or if you think it doesn't provide enough protections for the people who will be using recreational marijuana, then you'll want to vote against Issue 4. And that's it. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you can subscribe and join us on more explorations of Arkansas politics and history. You can also check out our videos on the other voter issues this year. And if you want to help us create more videos like this, consider donating to Arkansas on Patreon. Patreon is the easiest way to support content makers in a way that works for your budget. You decide how much you want to give each month, and you can change that donation amount at any time you want. And bigger donations get bigger perks, including a sneak peek at our upcoming documentary on the myths and truths around Harrison, Arkansas. And speaking of perks, thanks to our current patrons Zach Green, Tim in Vegas, Alan Archer, Blake Hulse, Boyd Stevens Smith Jr., Madeline Applegate Gross, and Poetize with Deanna Starshine for making this video happen. Thanks again, and see you next time for more Arkansans.